formally. And also let me say that this event is organized by the Cuban Research Institute, which I direct, as well as the American Caribbean Center and the FIU Libraries. And it's part as well of the FIU Library travel grants to study the Ayala popular music collection. So Marisol Quevedo is a PhD candidate in musicology at Indiana University, where she's currently a research associate at the Latin American Music Center. She's worked at different capacities as a graduate assistant, associate instructor, and has been the co-president of the Graduate Musicology Association of Indiana. She holds a BM in flute performance from the University of Central Florida. She also attended the Music Conservatory, Conservatorio de Música de Puerto Rico, where she studied flute, cello, and music theory. She's written several entries on Latin American musicians for the revised New World Dictionary of American Music, published in 2013. And Marisol was telling me yesterday that this is a sort of standard source of information on this on American music. She's also presented her work in various professional venues, most recently at the meeting of the Cuban Heritage Collection, a very successful conference on Cuban studies there at the University of Miami, as well as the American Musicological Society and the meetings of the Society of Ethnomusicology. She's currently writing her doctoral dissertation on the topic of today's presentation, Art and Music After the 1959 Revolution, where she examines the relationship among music, composition, national identity, and the Cuban socialist regime. The title of her presentation today is part of that dissertation, Experimental Music for the People, Avant-garde Composition in Post-1959 Cuba. So, welcome.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank the Cuban Research Institute and Professor Duani and everyone, Madeline, Paola, Aime, everyone who has made it possible for me to be here. The lovely people at the library with the Cristobal Díaz Ayala collection, Amor, and Veronica, and everyone who's worked and helped digitizing some of these. One of the sound clips that we're going to hear today is from an LP from the collection, so that's very exciting. I also want to thank my friends who have taken me in and made me part of their own, so thank you very much. Make me feel very at home, not just at the collection, which Veronica and her colleagues have done, but also just, you know, you have to be a human and work, you know, and do other things other than research, right? No. So this paper I'm going to present at the American Musicological Society in November, and it's going to be a little bit more formal there. I have presented it already for my musicology department, so it was very long, and I cut it, and I'm trying to present it very, in a less formal way, because this is a little bit more familial kind of environment. But it will also be extended into a longer version that will hopefully be part of be a chapter in a book about experimentalism in music in Latin America in the 60s and 70s, and that's actually very exciting because it's a topic that is little discussed and researched. And of course it's part of my dissertation. So after the 1959 revolution, Cuban composers Harold Gramash, Juan Blanco, and Leo Brouwer remained in the island and held administrative and advising positions at prominent cultural institutions. These three composers promoted new avant-garde and experimental musics by contextualizing them within the reconfigured cultural framework of the revolution. This new framework allowed these composers to disseminate experimental music as long as it supported the revolution's goals of shaping the hombre nuevo, the communist new man, and offered an alternative to the bourgeois, capitalist, imperialist, commercial culture the revolution opposed. Cuban composers' support of experimental music carried aesthetic meaning in two intersecting ways. First, as part of a long tradition of leftist, vanguardista artists, and second, as part of the revolution's cultural politics of enacting social change through culture. The rebellious nature of the work produced by the Cuban composers prior to the 1959 revolution challenged the existing norms of art and the traditional music canon that was upheld by the cultural establishment. This rebellious spirit was at the heart of the revolutionary ideals that challenged the capitalist, hegemonic power wielded by the United States. The composers who stayed in Cuba after 1959 continued to compose and promote music that was more avant-garde and experimental than before the revolution. Encouraging the experience of avant-garde and experimental art in the everyday, fulfilled the Cuban Revolution's goal of shaping a socially conscious citizen because it broadened the access to all cultural forms of expression instead of restricting that access to this type of art to the intellectual elite. In the early years of the Cuban Revolution, Brouwer, Gramache, and Blanco shared the ideals of the revolutionary leaders, Alfredo Guevara and Fidel Castro, of broadening access to culture and using culture in the service of the revolution. Although the music championed by these Cuban composers may have challenged the expectations of the traditional concert-going audience, its political significance gained its creators the support of the Cuban revolutionary government. So today my presentation will focus on basically three points or three big structural items. First, I will look at the aesthetic views held and circulated before the 1959 revolution by composers Juan Blanco and Harold Gramache. Their pre-1959 writings and activities anticipate the cultural policies of the revolutionary government, revealing a strong connection between pre-1959 leftist intellectuals and the post-1959 revolutionary cultural agenda. Then I'll move into a discussion of Blanco and Brouwer's roles in promoting the avant-garde and experimental music after 1959. And then I'm going to look at two compositions that will serve as case studies to see what this experimental music and avant-garde music sounded like. And one is Brouwer's music for the critically acclaimed film Lucia. I'm sure a lot of you have at least heard of it, if not watched it. And also the music for... Huh? I'm sorry. you're thinking about it, right? And his orchestral work from 1967-69, La Tradición se rompe, pero cuesta trabajo, which is the one that we have the LP and the recording here at the collection. So a little bit of the vanguardista background. In the 1920s and 30s, the vanguardista tradition was rooted in artistic manifestations from actually, the vanguardista tradition from the 60s was rooted in the vanguardista tradition from the 20s and 30s, which was the Grupo Minorista and the Afro-Cubanista artistic movement. Composers Amadeo Roldán and Alejandro García Carturla developed a compositional style associated with this movement. And one of the ways in which they reflected the Minorista concerns was through their use of Afro-Cuban percussion, rhythms, melodies, and forms. Among Cuban musicologists, even today, Roldán and Carturla are considered the first musical vanguardia, and then the second vanguardia, starting in 1959, with the revolution marking that second vanguardia. And they claim Roldán and Carturla as their predecessors. Then in the 1940s, we have the Grupo de Renovación Musical. So Roldán and Carturla died unexpectedly in 1939 and 1940, respectively, and this sort of created a gap. So one of the things that happened was that a young Spanish composer of the name of José Ardébol, who had traveled to Cuba in 1919, took over, especially the teaching duties at the Conservatorio Municipal de La Habana, that Roldán had sort of left that gap, or after he died. And he came from Spain, but also even after arriving in Cuba, he developed a very neoclassical approach to composition. So this was following more the tradition of Manuel de Falla, Maurice Ravel, the neoclassical period of Stravinsky. So we have a return to old forms, still with a modernist tonality and musical language, but thinking about the past, about Baroque and classical forms. So one of the things that comes out of this is that he has the opportunity to send a young Cuban composer to the United States to study in Tanglewood with Aaron Copland and Sergei Kusevitsky. And he's told, send whoever you think is the most promising composer. And he feels he doesn't have the authority to do that, so he establishes a competition, a contest. And so as part of, or in line with this neoclassical training, he tells the students, you are all going to compose piano sonatas. This is, piano sonatas, we're talking about mid-1700s. So this is how far back they're going in terms of the neoclassical perspective. And he tells them, he puts together a committee that they look at all of the pieces and they select a winner, and the winner is Harold Gramash. So Harold Gramash in 1942 goes to Tanglewood in Massachusetts and study with American composers. But he felt that the effort was so great from all of the students that had put in the effort to write these compositions that they do a recital to showcase all of their works. And out of this recital, the Grupo de Renovación comes, or emerges. And at first they're like, is this a school? Is this a movement? What do we do with this? And so there's writings where we can see how they start to establish what it is that they are looking for aesthetically. And eventually in 48, each of the members of the group develop their individual styles, so it kind of disintegrates because they're all looking into different venues and musical language, especially like Edgardo Martin and Argeliers León were always doing the Afro-Cuban thing. Even within the neoclassical forms, they were always putting a little bit of conga or a little bit of son. And so the group disbands, and then what happens is in the 50s, we have the Sociedad Cultural Nuestro Tiempo. So Harold Gramash comes out of the Grupo de Renovación Musical, and he becomes the president and founder, among with other artists, of the Sociedad Cultural Nuestro Tiempo. And this was not just a musical group like the Grupo de Renovación Musical, they were only composers and performers. But the Sociedad Cultural Nuestro Tiempo had filmmakers and dancers and poets and visual artists. So we have a very broad group that are always constantly working with each other and collaborating on projects, like doing music for ballet that someone's going to choreograph, or the music for a film that someone's going to do, or the music for a gallery exhibit of new art. So that kind of thing is what happens at this time. So in their manifesto, the Sociedad Cultural Nuestro Tiempo, they set out, we come about to bring the people to art, bring it closer to the aesthetic and cultural concerns of our time. Precisely now that sensing these realities already, it demands a vehicle that allows it to appreciate and assimilate them for its quickest cultural formation and maturing. Where we are the voice of a new generation that arises in a moment during which violence, despair, and death want to take over as the only solutions. Gramash was the president, and Juan Blanco was the secretary and editor of the journal. They claimed political neutrality, but through their writings, you can see that they're very leftist and always fighting against Batista's regime and the cultural landscape and context in which they are trying to promote new music. Their writings critiqued the prevailing conservative and traditionalist views of the establishment, and the taste of individuals in charge, especially of programming the concerts, the music that would be playing concerts for the Orquesta Filarmónica de La Habana, because they insisted on the inclusion of Cuban and Latin American composers and of contemporary Cuban and Latin American composers. On top of that, they also organized their own concerts and lectures to promote new music. So Harold Gramash writes an article on the 30th anniversary of the Orquesta Filarmónica de La Habana, and instead of praising all the great things, how far it's come, and look at all the marvelous things that have happened, he actually just harshly critiques the history of it. Basically, after Amadeo Roldán dies, who was the conductor of the Orquesta Filarmónica de La Habana at that time, he says it's all downhill from there. And so he points to very specific issues, and yeah, this is not quite there yet. But the first thing is that there's a lack of interest in promoting new and Cuban symphonic repertory. And he says, Eric Kleiber arrived with the, and this is a quote from the article, Eric Kleiber arrived with the undisputed capacity for the position of main conductor, but affected in his Germanic arrogance by a certain contempt towards Latin American music and for national symphonic production. The orchestra under his direction reached unforeseen quality, but this was accompanied, unfortunately, by a traditionalist repertory, depriving the people from contact with good contemporary music and symphonic scores of the country, that is Cuba. He also points that it was not just the conductors that would come by, but if a good conductor that did promote new and Latin American music and Cuban music came, then it was the patronage that opposed that. And so if this happened in particular with an Argentinian composer, Juan José Castro, he was there for only a year because he wanted to promote new music, but then the patronage wouldn't let him. So this lack of support for new Latin American and Cuban music, he lists as one of the major setbacks in the development of the musical culture of Cuba. The government, in his mind, had failed to see importance of a symphonic ensemble for the country's reputation and morale. And here he says, because there hasn't been a government capable of understanding that we cannot call ourselves a civilized people without the existence of a symphonic ensemble that keeps it in touch with the great music of all time periods, and composers with an instrument which is the only medium to deliver to his people the efforts of his work. So here we see that he is using the standards of culture that are coming from European and US models, from Western white powers. He's using the symphonic orchestra, which is something that developed completely in Europe and then in the United States and Latin America. But you know, his category or his standards for what is civilized are very American and very European. So the solution to him is that the government needs to take constitutional measures. It is necessary to stabilize the orchestra's economic life by way of permanent laws that guarantee the livelihood of the musicians so that he can regain his discipline. Because at this point he's saying, well, the musicians have to gig, you know, in dance orchestras and here and there, so they're not practicing and they're not perfecting their technique. That's because they don't make enough money as orchestra musicians. So if the government stepped in and said, well, here's the money for the musicians so that that's the only thing that they do, then that would improve the quality. Gramsci implicitly points to his and the society's members' political leanings in all of this. And these writings foreshadow the work he would support and lobby for after 1959. So in the wake of the 1959 revolution, the members of Nuestro Tiempo openly supported the new regime. In January 2nd, 1959, the society inserted so the journal, they published a journal for many years, and they inserted in the journal an additional leaf containing a statement that was quickly drafted in the dawn of the revolution. So the journal had already gone to print, and the revolution happened, and they felt they needed to make a statement, so they drafted something very quickly and inserted it into the journal, the issue from January 1959. In the letter, Nuestro Tiempo congratulates the new administration in overthrowing the previous dictatorship. So the political leanings are pretty obvious at this point. And he takes the liberty, well, the article is actually unsigned, but I'm going to assume that it was either Blanco or Gramsci that were involved in writing it, because Blanco was the editor of the journal and Gramsci was the president. But the writer of the article takes the liberty to speak for all Cuban artists and intellectuals who opposed the previous administration. It follows the initial congratulatory remarks with a list of goals the new administration should keep in mind for, quote, the transformative revolution of our civil society to be reflected in the cultural realm, unquote. And here's the list of those measures that the government needs to take in terms of culture. The complete reorganization of the National Institute of Culture and its placement in the hands of the most responsible exponents of our art, our sciences, and our letters. Tight links between the country's high cultural manifestations with an intensive popular education divulgation, so mass education in terms of and mass dissemination of their music or of the arts. Complete respect of the free broadcasting of thinking in all of its creative manifestations. Moral and material support from the state for the country's artistic and cultural organizations and their work, and strict respect of their independence and, of criteria and action. Free cultural exchange in the international realm without any sort of crippling restrictions. Channeling of Cuban culture through revelatory paths of our best liberal and revolutionary traditions that promote our national character. And battle against disfiguring cosmopolitanism that damages the national cultural heritage, as tends to happen, for example, in the realm of popular music. And here they're taking a direct jab at the influx of American pop music. They don't like it. They think it's tarnishing the local popular traditions. And he then goes on to explain who should be involved in, or at least who shouldn't be involved in this no cultural work. So in rejoicing over the democratic victory that our people has just achieved, hopes that finally united above discrepancies of aesthetic theory or of political leanings, all the intellectuals and artists and all the cultural institutions that did not tarnish themselves with embarrassing alliances with the dictatorship will unite so that 1959 marks, in the cultural as well as in the political realms, the beginning of a new, higher, and memorable stage for Cuba. So the author excludes from revolutionary cultural efforts those individuals and institutions who collaborated with the previous administration. The declaration from January 2nd, 1959 by Nuestro Tiempo reveals the group's political leanings as well as their views on the role of culture in civil society and the relationship between state, cultural institutions, and artists and intellectuals. This statement, the letter, specifies what to promote. So it's liberal, revolutionary, and national traditions, and the popular education of culture, popularization of culture, and also from what to protect Cuban culture, and specifically disfiguring cosmopolitanism. This is a term, cosmopolitanism, that keeps recurring as the bad thing. You can be universal is great, cosmopolitanism, bad, bad, bad. So it is no surprise that several of the members of Nuestro Tiempo became involved in directing new cultural institutions in the early years of the revolution. Harold Gramache and Juan Blanco went on to hold important administrative and diplomatic positions after 1959. Gramache actually went on to be the Cuban ambassador to France for a few years, and he was a little bit shocked when he was asked, and the administration told him, but you are an artist, you already know how to be a diplomat. And he took it, and he then continued all these ties between Europe and Cuba, because we sometimes think that everything was severed, but no, they actually continued. And Juan Blanco went on to become the music advisor for a lot of institutions, especially like the radio and television, the National Symphony Orchestra, I mean, you name it, he was involved in it. Their artistic activities in the years preceding the revolution set the basis for their post-revolutionary cultural policies. So then we move on to the 1960s and 70s. During this period, Cuban composers created avant-garde and experimental music that reached audiences through everyday experiences. In films, at their jobs as factory workers, because there were some artists that toured and played for factory workers, in public spaces such as parks and boulevards, and they would set up speakers throughout. And there was actually a piece by Blanco that was an electroacoustic piece that he composed. It's called Ambientación de la Rampa, and it was 30 nights of electronic music being blasted through speakers that were set through a section of La Rampa, and people were just supposed to walk around and enjoy it. So these are the ways in which they are reaching the masses, and at least people in their everyday experiences through experimental music. And also in what I call more special or extraordinary settings, such as symphonic music festivals and concerts, because you would have to make the effort to go to these events. But they were still very open to the public and were not restricted to only those who could purchase the tickets, which was the case beforehand. Blanco and Brauer's writings during the first decade of the revolution offer us insight into how they used avant-garde music in the service of the revolution, how the resources and institutions created after the revolution enabled them to promote avant-garde music, and how they engaged with the broader international context of avant-garde art. Juan Blanco did not agree with the aesthetic goals of certain Soviet and conservative socialist composers, and encouraged Cuban composers to experiment with styles and techniques deemed unacceptable by foreign composers and musicologists who promoted musical conservatism. So in 1961, Blanco writes a report for Revista Casa de las Américas on all the musical activities, and among the activities that he writes about was a visit to Cuba by East German and Soviet composers and musicologists, and have him listed at the very top here. During their visit, they had listening and discussion sections with the Cuban composers. They would bring records and music scores and would talk about what is good music and that kind of thing. So Blanco noted that, quote, "The most polemic reaction of our visitors was captured in their reaction to the position of the most advanced Cuban composers, who presented their view that the development of new styles and techniques such as 12-tone compositions, aleatoric music, microtonalism, athematism, electronic and concrete music, etc., constitute achievements of humanity," again, this alluding to universality, "that stripped from all orthodoxy or dogmatism can be put to good use by composers of our time to enrich their works." So Blanco describes the foreign visitor's attitude toward the Cuban composer's judgment of new music and techniques as polemic, and implicitly defends the Cuban composer's stance by explaining that these techniques can be used by any composer to enrich his or her language, as long as they're stripped of orthodoxy and dogmatism, which are code terms for bourgeois capitalist decadence. We repeatedly find Cuban composers defending their use of new compositional techniques. Any technique is useful if stripped from ideological or political context and reused within their work as revolutionary composers. So, one of the first composers that was very active, very young but very active, and still is actually quite active, is Leo Brouwer. He was, I think, 21 years old at the time of the revolution. He won a scholarship from the revolution when it happened to study in New York. And this was before the embargo, so he was able to study in New York before all of the travel restrictions, and well, all of the restrictions. He was known as initially as a guitar virtuoso, and you talk to any guitarist, they will immediately know who Leo Brouwer is. He changed the way that guitar is performed. He brought a whole new set of techniques to the guitar repertoire in terms of how you can use the instrument. So he's very important in that sense. But eventually he couldn't play as much, so he dedicated himself more to conducting later on in his career, and of course as a composer. He served as music advisor to several institutions, including the Cuban Film Institute, or the ICAIC. He was the director of the music section of the ICAIC when he was like 21 years old. Who would want to have that job, right? 21. So his writings for various culture and music journals chronicle the history of avant-garde music since 1959, and they reveal the powerful and influential network that he and other composers established within cultural institutions in Cuba and outside of Cuba by maintaining contact with foreign avant-garde music circles. So his compositions during the 60s are marked by experimentation, use of geometric and graphic patterns, aleatoric passages, use of pitch cells, serial techniques, and in all of his post-1959 writings regarding the avant-garde music in Cuba, he frames the music and the composer's role within the Cuban Revolution's ideological agenda all the time. That's what he's constantly doing. So, for example, in the late 60s, Brouwer critiqued the support structure for music and art in bourgeois capitalist countries, mainly in the United States, and he posited that oppressed cultures have an answer, a solution to the imposition of cultural and aesthetic values from the oppressor. So the solution of a colonized country lies in suppressing the defining traits of the oppressing culture and not the common traits of universal culture. So we see this recurring theme here. Brouwer specifically opposed the institutional framework that cultivates new music for being out of touch with the masses in their ivory towers, and also, quote, the mythical role assigned by the establishment, and he uses the word establishment in Spanish, to composers in capitalist society. Cuban composers, Brouwer argued, were in touch with the everyday people and had taken over the actual making of history, which led to their ability to experiment in their own ways. Music is one area, and I'm quoting here from an essay that he wrote in 1970. Music is one area of culture that enriches the socio-political complex of the people. It identifies itself with the people and represents it. I do not conceive of culture as a product alienated from man, and thereby from the society that conceived it. The musician is a worker in the specific semantic sense of the word, and worker, trabajador, obrero. This is the kind of revolutionary language that he continues to use to describe the role of musicians and composers within the revolution. Brouwer considered innovation a key condition of revolutionary culture. To innovate is, without a doubt, one of the most difficult things to achieve during a time such as our current century, during which there is a great richness of means. It is also radically one of the conditions of the revolutions, to innovate, one of the conditions of the revolution. In a world of constant change, of dialectic vision, innovation becomes part of the revolution's mechanism without turning it into routine. In a permanent revolution, all the parts and mechanisms that need to be changed are revolutionized or transformed. So So Brouwer defended Cuban musicians and composers' use of the most avant-garde techniques within the context of the revolutionary ideals, stating that these did not pose a threat to the revolution because the revolution itself stood for and supported the most advanced scientific and artistic developments. And here we have another quote. Well, he states that the incorporation of the most advanced technical means do not present a danger or deformation, given that it is the line of the Cuban Revolution to arrive at the highest technification of production. So, Brouwer's writings justified how new music functioned and fulfilled the ideological goals of the Cuban Revolution through constant innovation, as well as how the Cuban Revolution benefited composers who experimented with new music techniques by allowing the composer to be in closer contact with the people. The language employed by Brouwer also points to the Cold War dichotomies of East communist versus West capitalist, and the pressure on Cuban composers to prove they were creating works just as avant-garde and experimental as composers in other countries, but with the benefit of a socio-political system that supported their works' mass dissemination. So, in 1961, Brouwer traveled to Poland to attend the Warsaw Autumn Music Festival, and for non-music people, in the 1950s, in Warsaw, the composers started a new music festival that is still going on today, and it is a place where composers from all over the world can meet and exchange their work and listen to each other's work. So it's extremely important, extremely influential. So in the first issue of Casa Las Americas, Brouwer writes an article saying La Vanguardia en la Música Cubana. That's the title of the article. And in it, he sort of recounts the history of avant-garde music in Cuba since 1959. And the first thing, like the first step that he points to as being seminal in taking Cuban composers into that direction of avant-garde and experimental music is him attending the Warsaw Autumn. He says listening to the music in Warsaw was a vital impulse, a definitive point of departure for the Cuban avant-garde. And from there, he returns with scores and recordings of all of this music, and he shares them, and he has these listening events at the UNIAC and in other places where the composers would get together and listen to this music. He preceded this comment explaining that the relevance of this trip did not lay on encountering something new, but in the continuity of the contact and the needed saturation of the ear. So it was being in this environment where it was all new music, instead of a lot of situations would have been going to a concert at another country, and most of the music would have been the canon, the traditional repertory of symphonic music, and then inserting one new piece or something like that, which is still done today by most symphony orchestras. He also points that during those years, 1961-62, Cubans had started to be affected, to suffer from the consequences of the economic and cultural embargo imposed by the United States of America on Cuba, and that's where the important lays in that contact with Poland, that it offered an alternative route to avant-garde new music because the American composers were going to Poland. So this was a place where the Cuban composers could have access to new music from just about everywhere. So in 1964 marks another year. This is where Brouwer says in his article La Vanguardia en la Música Cubana that Cuban composers' first fruits in avant-garde and experimental music start to reach more people. A series of events that not only presented Cuban artists and audiences with new music by Cuban composers, but also framed these compositions with other works that reflected the same avant-garde